The truth of that night didn't begin with violence, it began with trust. Inside the silence. The Harvey Family Murders. The door was never forced, because the danger was never outside. What began as a silent discovery now turns into a story of access, trust, and betrayal. The first chapter ended with silence. This one begins with betrayal. What happened that night was never random. The autopsy results marked the first moment when the case began to move from uncertainty into measurable truth. Until that point, investigators had only the scene itself to interpret what had happened. The post-mortem examinations, however, offered a controlled and methodical reconstruction of how each life had ended. What immediately became clear was that the deaths were not the result of a single chaotic outburst. Each fatal injury reflected intention. The patterns of trauma showed that the killer did not strike blindly or without direction. The force used was consistent with a planned act rather than a sudden loss of control. This distinction was crucial. It suggested forethought. It suggested purpose. Another critical finding was the absence of extensive defensive injuries across the victims. This did not mean there was no resistance at all, but it strongly indicated that the attack unfolded in a way that limited the opportunity to fight back. In practical terms, this pointed towards surprise, close-range proximity, or a situation in which the victims did not immediately recognize the threat. The medical findings also allowed investigators to begin estimating the narrow window in which the deaths occurred. These estimates would later be aligned with digital and witness data to form a more precise timeline of the night. The margin was not wide. Whatever happened inside the house took place within a relatively confined span of time. Equally important was what the autopsies did not show. There was no indication of prolonged struggle throughout the home, no evidence of a running pursuit from room to room. The scene still reflected containment rather than disorder. Violence had occurred, but it had not erupted outward into chaos. This reinforced an uncomfortable conclusion that investigators were already reaching from the crime scene layout alone. The killer had maintained control over the environment, control over movement, control over timing, control over access. These are not the characteristics of a random intruder acting under pressure. They are the characteristics of someone who enters a space without resistance. Although specific weapon information was held back during the early stages of the investigation, the nature of the injuries allowed law enforcement to infer that the same method had been used consistently. This again pointed toward a planned act rather than improvised violence. The uniformity across victims eliminated many early alternate theories. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of the autopsy phase was not technical at all. It was the confirmation that none of the victims died instantly in public chaos. Their deaths occurred behind closed doors, without witnesses, without intervention, and without an opportunity for help to arrive. From a forensic standpoint, this phase of the investigation transformed the case from a mystery defined by silence into one shaped by measurable facts, timing, injury patterns, and method. And those facts did not describe randomness, they described intention. It was never a break-in, it was a betrayal. As investigators widened the timeline beyond the walls of the Harvey home, attention turned outward to the surrounding neighborhood. If the crime had unfolded without visible force or noise inside the house, then the street itself, might hold the only external traces of movement. Neighbors were interviewed one by one. Doors were knocked on. Memories of the night were reconstructed through fragments of routine. Who stepped outside, who returned late, who noticed something that felt out of place only in hindsight. At first, there was very little. No one reported a dramatic confrontation. No one described clear screams or prolonged chaos in the early hours of the morning. The night, for most people on the street, had passed quietly. This absence of sound complicated the investigation, but it also reinforced a key theory. Whatever had happened inside the house had not announced itself to the outside world. Still, small details began to surface. Some neighbors recalled brief engine noise at an unusual hour. Others spoke of headlights passing slowly through the street, not at a speed typical of someone lost, but not fast enough to escape notice either. These observations were not on their own evidence, but when layered into the developing timeline, they began to outline the possibility of movement in and out of the area during a window when most residents were asleep. No neighbor reported seeing anyone clearly enter the Harvey home. No description was strong enough to stand on its own in court at this stage. But the lack of clear sightings was itself telling. This was not a street accustomed to frequent late-night traffic. Movement during those hours would normally be memorable. The fact that only fragments remained suggested that whatever presence did exist had been brief, controlled, and easy to overlook. Investigators also examined whether any unusual activity had been captured indirectly. Home security systems in nearby houses were reviewed where available. Doorbell cameras, motion sensors, and street-facing footage were requested. Much of what existed showed nothing dramatic. Quiet driveways, static sidewalks, empty stretches of road. But even uneventful footage served a purpose. It helped narrow the window during which activity could have occurred without being recorded. This process did not immediately identify a suspect vehicle or a confirmed entry. What it did do was tighten the boundaries of the timeline. The quiet of the neighborhood was no longer an abstract idea. It became a documented condition, a narrow corridor in which the crime had to fit, and this too favored one conclusion over another. A stranger operating at random would have needed luck, entering and escaping without being seen, without being heard, without triggering attention. Someone familiar with the environment would have needed only timing, someone who knew the rhythm of the street, the sleeping patterns of the houses, the silence between movements. By the end of this phase of the investigation, police had not uncovered a smoking gun from the neighbors, but they had uncovered something just as important: confirmation that the crime had unfolded under conditions of near-total quiet within a tightly defined window. The street had not ignored violence. The violence had simply passed through it without drawing attention. When investigators finally sat down with the person whose name had begun to surface repeatedly during the background checks, the conversation did not begin with accusation. At this stage, the approach was still controlled, procedural, almost neutral. The goal was not confrontation. It was calibration. Detectives needed a baseline, a clean version of events as told by the person now under quiet scrutiny. The initial statement appeared on the surface to be cooperative. The individual described the night in broad, unremarkable terms: ordinary movements, familiar locations, nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately raised alarm. The tone was steady. There was no visible panic, no outward resistance. On paper, It looked like an account that could easily dissolve into the background of many similar interviews conducted in the early hours of a major investigation. But investigators are trained not to listen only to what is said. They listen for what is fixed and what shifts. As follow-up questions were introduced, small variations began to appear. Not enough to be called lies outright, but enough to prevent the account from locking into place. A time reference that softened when revisited. A movement that became less precise with repetition. A detail that seemed firm in the first telling, then repositioned subtly in the second. Individually, none of these adjustments would have justified suspicion. People misremember. Stress distorts recall. Fatigue reshapes certainty. But taken together, these inconsistencies began to form a pattern. And once detectives notice a pattern, they stop hearing mistakes. They start hearing construction. The real tension emerged when this verbal account was quietly cross-checked against independent records. Nothing dramatic was announced in the room. There was no shift in tone from the investigators. But outside the interview, timestamps began to stack. Digital movement, communication logs, gaps where activity should have existed, and traces where none were expected. The first true contradiction did not arrive with confrontation. It arrived with silence. A window of time that could not be accounted for. At this point, investigators did not interrupt the flow of cooperation. They allowed the statement to complete itself. Every version, every clarification, every adjustment was documented exactly as offered. The objective was no longer to gather information. It was to preserve the shape of the story before pressure altered it. When the interview ended, the individual left without formal restraint. There was no arrest, no dramatic exit, only the quiet understanding among those in the room that the investigation had just pivoted into a new phase. Because from that moment forward, the case no longer revolved around unknown possibilities. It revolved around a version of events that no longer fully aligned with reality. And once a timeline fractures, everything that rests upon it begins to destabilize. Once the first cracks had appeared in the initial statement, the investigation shifted from listening to measuring. This is the phase where stories are no longer evaluated for tone or confidence, but for alignment. What someone says is no longer judged by how convincing it sounds, but by how precisely it fits against independent systems that cannot be persuaded. Phone records were examined in detail, not only outgoing calls but missed calls, inactive periods, and brief moments of signal loss. Each timestamp created a pressure point against the spoken timeline. Communication patterns that had once seemed ordinary now carried weight. Who was contacted? When? And just as importantly, when contact suddenly stopped, location data followed. Not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual narrowing. Movement through space leaves traces even when intention is invisible. The claimed path of travel was placed alongside digital footprints. In some places, the two overlapped cleanly. In others, they did not meet at all. These gaps were not loud, they were quiet. But quiet gaps in a timeline are where investigations often live. Physical evidence was layered in next. Not revealed publicly, not dramatized in press briefings, but circulated internally with growing clarity. What had been found at the scene was compared to what could be connected beyond it. Patterns began to repeat. Correlations formed where coincidence had once been suspected. And with each alignment, the circle around the suspect tightened. Investigators did not rush this convergence. They allowed contradictions to accumulate naturally. The danger of confronting too early is that it teaches someone where the weak points in the case are. Instead, detectives built a structure strong enough that when pressure was finally applied, it would not collapse under questioning. The weight of the evidence did not arrive all at once. It arrived in layers. First, the timeline bent. Then, the digital record disagreed. Then, physical indicators refused to align with the narrative. Each individual discrepancy could have been explained away. Together, they could not. By this phase of the investigation, the question was no longer whether the initial story was inaccurate. It was how far from the truth it truly was. The case had crossed a line. What had once been uncertainty was now direction. Possibility had become probability, and probability was rapidly approaching certainty. From the outside, nothing had changed. There were no public arrests, no press conferences announcing breakthroughs. But inside the investigation, the shape of the truth was becoming unmistakable, and the room for escape was disappearing. The shift from interest to custody did not arrive with spectacle. There were no flashing lights outside a home, no dramatic pursuit through city streets. The transition was procedural, controlled, and deliberate, the kind that reflects confidence rather than urgency. By the time the individual was taken into custody, investigators were no longer testing possibilities. They were protecting a structure of evidence that was already holding its shape. Inside the interview room, the atmosphere changed immediately. What had once been framed as cooperation now carried the weight of consequence. The posture across the table was no longer that of a helpful witness. It was that of a person confronted with proximity to accusation, even if the word itself was not yet spoken aloud. The early phase of the interrogation was careful. Questions were not aggressive. They were precise. The objective was not to shock or intimidate, but to observe how the narrative behaved under pressure. Would the story compress? Would it fracture further? Would it attempt to adapt again? At first, the version held. Then, gradually, it began to strain. Certain answers lost their sharpness. Timelines that had once been delivered with confidence softened at the edges. Clarifications grew longer. Explanations became more conditional. This is a familiar psychological progression, the point at which maintaining a constructed account requires more effort than simply repeating it. Investigators allowed the tension to build without filling the silences. Silence in an interrogation room is not empty. It invites internal dialogue. It forces attention inward. It creates space for the mind to confront contradictions that the voice is still trying to outrun. Whether the shift came through admission, emotional collapse, or the quiet acknowledgement of what the evidence had already established, the structure of resistance did not fail loudly. It failed inward. The moment of change did not arrive as an outburst. It arrived as a loss of control over the narrative. From that point forward, the interrogation was no longer about verification. It was about resolution. What had begun as distance between story and evidence began to close. The truth no longer had to be chased through contradictions. It began to surface through alignment. When the account finally stopped moving, it did so because there was nowhere left for it to go. By the end of this phase, the investigation no longer operated on inference. The case had crossed into assertion. The person in the room was no longer being evaluated as a possibility. They were being processed as the center of the crime. The courtroom became the final stage where everything that had moved in silence now had to exist in public. What had once been hidden inside walls, records, and interview rooms was laid out under formal procedure. Timelines were reconstructed. Evidence was introduced piece by piece. Each fact that had once existed as a quiet pressure point inside the investigation was now given a voice. The prosecution's case was not built on a single dramatic revelation. It unfolded through accumulation, digital traces, behavioral contradictions, physical indicators. Each element returned to the same conclusion through a different path. The story was no longer shaped by what someone claimed had happened, but by what could be demonstrated independent of personal narrative. Across the room, the defense worked to loosen that structure. Doubt was introduced wherever space allowed. Alternative interpretations were suggested. The effort was to slow certainty, not to erase it entirely. This is how many trials move. Not through complete opposition to the facts, but through the attempt to soften their edges. For the remaining relatives of the Harvey family, the courtroom experience carried a weight that extended far beyond legal procedure. Every day of testimony reopened wounds that had never closed. They were no longer standing outside the story as observers. They had become witnesses to the formal retelling of a loss that had already reshaped their lives. When the moment of decision arrived, it did not come with spectacle. There was no theatrical pause that matched the scale of the crime. A verdict is delivered in measured language, no matter how heavy its meaning. Responsibility was assigned not through emotion, but through confirmation. The sentence that followed acknowledged what could not be undone. No punishment can restore 4 lives. No duration of confinement can rebalance what was lost. But the judgment marked the end of uncertainty. It placed the weight of consequence where the investigation had long pointed. From a legal standpoint, the case was now closed. From a human standpoint, it never truly would be. The individual at the center of the trial would now move into a different kind of isolation, one defined by walls, routine, and the permanence of public record. The name would no longer exist without association. Identity itself had been reshaped by the outcome. For the Harvey family, the conclusion of the trial did not represent closure in the emotional sense. It represented something narrower. The end of unanswered questions. The end of who, but not the end of why, and never the end of what if. When the legal process ended and the courtroom emptied, what remained was not silence, but absence. The Harvey family home did not return to being just another house on a quiet street. Even as time passed, the structure remained marked by what had happened inside it. For the neighborhood, the memory of that night became woven into daily life in subtle ways. Through caution where trust once lived easily, through doors that stayed locked just a moment longer, through routines that now carried awareness beneath their surface. For those who had known the family, loss did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived repeatedly, in birthdays that went uncelebrated, in school years that never continued, in ordinary milestones that no longer had 4 people attached to them. The passing of years does not erase absence. It only changes the shape in which it is carried. Public attention eventually moved on, as it always does. Headlines faded. New stories took their place. But the impact of this case did not fade for those who lived with its consequences. The truth remained fixed. This was not a tragedy born from chance or randomness. It was the result of familiarity turned into access, and access turned into destruction. What makes the Harvey case endure is not only the scale of loss, but the way it redefines a basic assumption that danger announces itself from the outside. This case did not unfold through broken windows, forced doors, or visible struggle. It unfolded through trust, through proximity, through someone who had already been allowed close enough to cause irreversible harm. In the end, justice arrived in the form the system could offer. Accountability was assigned. The question of who was answered. But the deeper question, how betrayal can live undetected inside ordinary life, remains without a clean resolution. It lingers not as a mystery, but as a lesson that resists comfort. The Harvey family did not vanish into anonymity. Their story continues to exist as a reminder written into memory, not only of what was taken, but of how quietly it can happen, and that is the echo they leave behind. The truth is no longer hidden. The door was never forced, because the danger was never outside. What ended this family was not chance, not a random act of violence, but a moment where trust became access, and access became destruction. Justice may have closed the case, but the echo of what happened inside that house will never truly fade. Some doors don't need to be broken into, they only need to be opened once. Who do we allow into our lives, and how well do we truly know them? Next on True Echoes. For 11 years, the world believed they were gone forever. 3 girls, 3 disappearances, 1 hidden house, and a nightmare that continued in silence until one door was finally opened: the Cleveland kidnappings. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. What do you think was the most critical turning point in this case? The night itself, the broken trust, or the first contradiction? Share your thoughts in the comments. And step into the echoes of truth.